What if a single stone, buried in the sands of Egypt for centuries, held the key to unlocking an entire lost civilization? It was the summer of 1799. The sun hung low over the Nile Delta, bleeding gold and crimson across the horizon. French soldiers, weary from heat and conquest, dug trenches around a small Egyptian town called Rosetta. They were engineers under Napoleon's commandment of discipline, sweat, and duty-building fortifications against the advancing British. But that day, as shovels clanged against something solid in the sand, the course of history shifted. The object wasn't gold, nor a weapon, nor anything of immediate value. It was a slab of black basalt, nearly 4 feet tall, carved with mysterious inscriptions. The soldiers brushed away the dust, and one of them noticed there were 3 distinct sections. 3 scripts etched in the same deliberate alignment. Greek at the bottom, Egyptian hieroglyphs at the top, and between them, something strange flowing lines known later as D. No one could read the top or middle sections. For centuries, the language of the pharaohs had been silenced. Their words turned to mystery. Temples, tombs, and monuments spoke in symbols no one could understand. But this stone, this single relic, promised a bridge between the ancient and the known. When news of the discovery reached Napoleon's scholars, his savants, as he called them, it caused a frenzy. They realized the Greek portion might hold the translation of the hieroglyphs above. It was as if the universe had handed them a cipher for humanity's oldest code. The stone was quickly moved under guard to Cairo, then carefully studied. Scholars pressed sheets of paper over it and rubbed ink across its surface, creating copies to send back to France. The British, still fighting Napoleon's forces, would later seize the stone and take it to London, where it would become the most famous artifact in the British Museum. But in that moment, beneath the Egyptian sun, no one truly grasped the magnitude of what had been found. For millennia, Egypt's secrets had been sealed in silence. The tombs of kings and queens bore stories of love, betrayal, power, and death, but they were mute. The priests who once knew the sacred words were gone. The knowledge of hieroglyphs, passed down for generations, had vanished sometime around the 4th century A.D. The Egyptians themselves could no longer read their own past. The Rosetta Stone changed that. Imagine holding in your hands the key to a forgotten world, a stone that whispers across 3,000 years. The Greek text, once translated, revealed that the stone was a royal decree from 196 BC. It praised a young king named Ptolemy V, listing his achievements and the honors bestowed upon him by priests. The same message, repeated in 3 languages, was designed to be read by priests, officials, and the people. It was routine politics, but buried within it was the code to resurrect a civilization. Decades passed before anyone truly deciphered it. The stone became an obsession across Europe, a race between scholars, a battle of intellect and pride. Everyone wanted to be the one who solved the mystery of Egypt's lost language. In France, a young linguistic genius named Jean-François took up the challenge. He was barely a teenager when he first saw copies of the inscriptions. His fascination consumed him. He taught himself ancient Greek, Coptic, the last surviving form of the Egyptian tongue, and several other languages, believing they were all threads of the same tapestry. His friends said he lived for nothing else. His notebooks overflowed with symbols and theories. He rarely slept, often collapsing from exhaustion at his desk. Meanwhile, in England, another Scholartimus Young was making progress of his own. A physician by trade, but a polymath by nature, Young studied the stone with meticulous logic. He noticed that some symbols were enclosed in ovals, or cartouches, which seemed to represent royal names. One of them, he realized, spelled Ptolemy. That was the first crack in the code. Yet it was Champollion who would push the door open. In 1822, after years of obsession, he stumbled upon something extraordinary. While comparing hieroglyphic signs with their Greek equivalents, he recognized patterns that weren't merely symbolic, they were phonetic. The hieroglyphs didn't just represent ideas. They represented sounds. It meant the ancient Egyptians had a complex writing system that combined pictures and phonetic letters. It was a revelation that shattered centuries of misconception. When Champollion rushed into his brother's office, clutching his notes, he cried out, "I've got it!" before fainting from sheer excitement. The world had finally rediscovered the voice of Egypt. Through the Rosetta Stone, the walls of temples began to speak. Hieroglyphs that once adorned tombs in silence now told stories of gods and kings, of rituals and wars, of birth, death, and the journey of the soul. The carvings in the Valley of the Kings revealed the lives of pharaohs long gone. The Book of the Dead Once, indecipherable, spoke of the afterlife and the weighing of the heart. For the first time in more than 1,000 years, humanity could listen to ancient Egypt tell its own story. But the stone carried more than language, it carried power. With every symbol decoded, Europe's fascination with Egypt deepened. Explorers, treasure hunters, and scholars flooded into the Nile Valley, unearthing tombs and artifacts in the name of discovery, often stripping them from their homeland. The Rosetta Stone became a symbol not just of knowledge, but of possession. To the British, it was a trophy, a spoil of war. To the Egyptians, it was a stolen voice, a sacred relic removed from its birthplace. And even now, more than 2 centuries later, that wound remains open. As you stand before the stone today, encased in glass beneath the soft lights of the British Museum, you can feel its quiet gravity. The surface is cracked and worn, its inscriptions dulled by time and touch. But behind that glass, it hums with invisible energy, the echo of 2 civilizations colliding. One ancient and divine, the other modern and ambitious. Tourists gaze at it, snapping photos, unaware of the turmoil it caused, the battles of intellect and empire it inspired. If you realize that the Rosetta Stone is more than an artifact. It's a conversation frozen in time between worlds that once could not speak to each other. Champollion would spend the rest of his life deciphering hieroglyphs, building the foundations of Egyptology. Yet he never lived to see the full impact of his discovery. He died at the age of 41, his heart weakened by the years of relentless study. But the legacy he left behind was immortal, the restoration of an entire civilization's voice. Still, there are mysteries that even the Rosetta Stone couldn't solve. Inscriptions across the Sahara remain ancient temples whisper of gods whose names have never been spoken aloud in modern times. Symbols appear in distant lands from the Sinai to Sudan that seem related yet somehow different, as if Egypt's language had many forgotten cousins. And deep beneath the sands, archaeologists continue to find fragments of scripts, stories, and names that challenge our understanding of history. Could there be another stone out there, another key that might unlock an even older language, an older civilization, hidden beneath the layers of time? The Rosetta Stone gave us one voice back, but it also reminded us of how much we've lost. Its discovery was not just a triumph of intellect, it was a resurrection. A message across centuries, carved by hands that knew they were speaking to eternity. A message that says, even when knowledge dies, it can still be found again. And yet, one question still lingers. Question scholars rarely ask aloud. What if the Rosetta Stone wasn't a coin? She didn't sit. What if it wasn't chance that it survived the ages, waiting to be found in a single year of war and conquest? What if it was placed where it was, for someone to find? Because buried beneath that translation, hidden within the familiar lines of praise for a forgotten kingdom, believe their lies, something else. A riddle that even Champollion missed. A passage that doesn't quite fit. A sequence of symbols that don't belong in a royal decree. A code within the code. And if that's true, then perhaps the Rosetta Stone hasn't revealed all its secrets yet. The faint sound of wind brushed across the desert sands, whispering through broken columns and forgotten temples. The Rosetta Stone had spoken, but not everything it said was clear. In the flickering candlelight of 19th century study rooms, men bent over parchment copies, tracing each symbol, searching for something that might still lie beneath the surface. What if the translation wasn't complete? What if the stone's true message was never meant to be fully understood? Years after Champollion's death, whispers began to circulate among scholars, strange coincidences hidden in the text. The decree on the stone was simple enough. An edict honoring a young pharaoh. But a few scholars noticed irregularities, phrases that seemed redundant. Symbols that didn't match their Greek counterparts. Lines where the grammar was deliberately altered. It was as if someone had layered 2 messages together. one visible to the world and another meant for eyes that would come much later. In 8040, an English antiquarian named William Banks claimed to have discovered a pattern in the hieroglyphs, a sequence of repeated signs that didn't correspond to any known words. He wrote about it in private letters to the British Museum, suggesting the stone might hold a ritual encryption, perhaps an invocation to the gods hidden beneath the political decree. His letters were quietly filed away. A decade later, Banks was found dead in his study, his notes missing, his copy of the Rosetta inscription torn apart, pages scattered like dry leaves. Historians dismissed it as madness, yet buried in archives. Some of his sketches survived. One in particular showed a faint spiral drawn across the text, connecting specific hieroglyphs like a map of meaning only he could see. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the land itself began revealing new fragments. In 1852, excavations near the ancient city of Tanis uncovered another basalt slab, broken in half, its inscriptions badly eroded but strikingly similar to those on the Rosetta Stone. The pattern of text, the spacing, even the mix of scripts mirrored it almost perfectly. But there was a crucial difference. The Greek portion was missing. Without that key, the translation remained locked. French archaeologist Auguste Mariette, who examined the find, described an unsettling detail. In one section of the hieroglyphs, among praises to the gods, there appeared a phrase that shouldn't exist in any royal decree. He who holds the mirror of the sun shall awaken the voices of the past. The line defied known syntax, and yet the meaning was hauntingly clear. Mariette didn't publish that phrase in his report. It remained scribbled in his personal journal, hidden until his death. The entry ended abruptly with the words, "Perhaps it was never meant to be read." The mystery deepened. By the early 20th century, the Rosetta Stone had become an icon of Western scholarship, a triumph displayed beneath glass, while Egypt, now under foreign rule, watched its own voice locked away in a museum across the sea. Crowds came daily to stare at the stone, not realizing that its story was far from over. Under the soft museum lights, it seemed almost alive, its polished surface reflecting faintly like black water. In 1924, during a quiet night shift, a British museum curator named Alan Percy was cataloging the inscriptions when he noticed something peculiar. The reflection of the overhead lamp revealed fine, almost invisible lines running across the stone scratches that didn't match the chisel marks of the original text. Using a magnifying lens, Percy traced them, realizing they formed a geometric pattern, almost like a constellation. He documented his findings in a private notebook, noting how the lines connected specific hieroglyphs to each other, creating shapes that resembled the ancient Egyptian symbol for rebirth. But before he could share his discovery, Percy was transferred to another department, and his notes were quietly removed from the archives. Some say he was told never to speak of it again. Decades later, when X-ray imaging technology became available, experts scanned the stone, expecting to learn more about its surface composition. What they found was unsettling beneath the visible text. Faint traces of additional carvings appeared, sins that the stone might have been repurposed, its earlier inscriptions chiseled away and over. The Rosetta Stone wasn't entirely original. It was recycled from an older monument. That revelation changed everything. If the stone had been reused, then its origins predated Ptolemy's decree by centuries. The earlier carvings barely detectable showed signs of a different era, perhaps even a different purpose. Some symbols matched those found in temples dedicated to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. Others resembled markings from the Amarna period, when Egypt's religion and art had briefly revolted against centuries of tradition. The stone, it seemed, had lived many lives. And yet, even as scholars pieced together its past, Egypt itself began to rise again. The 20th century brought a new wave of pride and reclamation. Egyptian archaeologists took the lead in uncovering their own heritage. The Rosetta Stone, however, remained out of reach, still in London, still behind glass, still a relic of colonial possession. For many Egyptians, it wasn't just a matter of history, it was personal. In 2003, Egypt formally requested the return of the Rosetta Stone. The argument was simple. It was found on Egyptian soil, written by Egyptian priests, and belonged to Egypt's story. The British Museum refused. The debate reignited old wounds of empire, conquest, and cultural ownership. But beneath the politics lay something deeper. A fear that once the stone returned home, it might reveal something new. Something the world wasn't ready to see. Rumors spread among academics. A few claimed that modern imaging technology, infrared and laser scanning had uncovered more hidden layers, lines and etchings, invisible to the naked eye. One researcher hinted that, beneath the lower Greek text, faintly carved and later smoothed over, were words not in Greek, not in Egyptian, but in an unknown script. He called it the fourth voice. The researcher's paper was never published. The university quietly distanced itself from the claim, calling it speculative, even delusional. Yet fragments of his data scans and spectral readings were leaked online, showing irregular grooves along the stone's base. When enhanced, the shapes did resemble letters, though none from any known language. Could the Rosetta Stone, long believed to unite 3 languages, actually contain 4? And if so, who carved the 4th and why? Some believed it was a modern fabrication, perhaps scratches made during transport or restoration. But others pointed out that the grooves were beneath the later inscriptions, not above them. That meant they predated the decree entirely. In other words, the Rosetta Stone might have been carved, erased, and rewritten across generations of palimpsests of civilizations. And then came a moment that reignited everything. In 2015, an Egyptian team led by archaeologist Dr. Layla Khoury gained rare access to the British Museum's archives. Their mission was simple: to analyze the original quarrying patterns of basalt used during the Ptolemaic period. But when they examined microscopic samples from the stone's surface, they discovered mineral residues inconsistent with Egypt's Nile Delta. The basalt didn't come from Rosetta or even from Egypt. The material matched a source thousands of miles away, an ancient quarry in what is now southern Turkey. The Rosetta Stone, the most Egyptian of artifacts, wasn't Egyptian at all. That revelation sent shockwaves through the academic world. How could a royal Egyptian decree be carved on foreign stone? How did it end up in Rosetta? Was it brought there as tribute, as a relic, or as something older still, something the Ptolemaic priests found and repurposed, unaware of its true origins? Dr. Khoury proposed a radical theory. The stone was originally created as a sacred artifact by an earlier pre-dynastic culture, perhaps a civilization that influenced Egypt's early development. The decree of Ptolemy was carved atop it centuries later, turning a relic into propaganda. If true, the Rosetta Stone wasn't just a translation. It was a time capsule, preserving echoes of a forgotten people. But the discovery came with consequences. Soon after Dr. Khoury's findings leaked, access to the stone was restricted. Further testing was denied. Funding was withdrawn. Within a year, she vanished from public view. Officially, she retired. Unofficially, she disappeared. Her colleagues in Cairo received a single message from her before she went silent. "They're not letting me finish." And so, the stone sits in silence, once again its polished surface, reflecting the faces of countless visitors, its true history buried beneath layers of erasure. In the quiet of the museum, as evening descends and the crowds thin out, one can almost imagine the stone breathing. The shadows between the carved symbols deepen, and the faint reflection of the lights above seems to shift, as though the stone remembers the sun it once knew. Perhaps it's only imagination, or perhaps the Rosetta Stone is still speaking, but in a language no one alive can hear. Some nights, the museum guards have reported strange things, a soft humming near the display, the sound of faint scratching, as if the stone itself were carving new lines into its surface. The noise always stops when they look directly. One guard, an old man named Yusuf, who had immigrated from Alexandria, once swore he saw something reflected in the glass, not his own face, but an ancient one staring back at him. He never returned to work after that night. And so, the question endures. What secrets still lie beneath that black basalt surface? What messages are trapped in its silence, waiting for another discovery, another decoding, another soul willing to listen too closely? Perhaps the Rosetta Stone was never just a translator's dream. Perhaps it was a warning, a reminder that when we awaken the voices of the past, they might begin to whisper back. And maybe, somewhere in a dark room, another fragment waits, another piece of that ancient mirror of the sun. A stone that doesn't just speak of language, but of something much older. Something still listening, There are nights when silence feels heavier than sound, the kind of silence that seems to listen back. Deep inside the British Museum, past the velvet ropes and polished marble floors, that silence pressed like invisible weight. The Rosetta Stone sat alone in its glass enclosure, bathed in a cold, sterile glow. Cameras watched, alarms stood ready, but the stone didn't care. It had survived empires. It had seen languages die. It was older than the walls that confined it, and older still than the hands that dared to touch it. Months had passed since Dr. Layla Cowrey's disappearance. Her findings, though discredited publicly, had begun to circulate in quiet corners of academia. Whispers of a hidden script beneath the carvings reached a small circle of researchers who refused to let the story die. Among them was Dr. Michael Reeves, an epigrapher from Oxford, known for his unshakable rationality. He didn't believe in conspiracies or curses, but something about Cowrey's report unsettled him. The idea that the Rosetta Stone wasn't Egyptian, that it was carved from alien basalt hauled across continents before Egypt even existed, seemed impossible. And yet, the more he read, the more the impossibility felt like an invitation. Reeves spent his nights studying archived images of the stone's surface, using advanced imaging software to analyze the faint marks left by centuries of handling. He expected nothing but noise, restoration, scratches, mineral imperfections. But one night, under a filter designed to isolate micro-reflective patterns, a sequence of shapes emerged. They weren't random. They formed symmetry, geometry, almost like an alignment of stars. He froze. The pattern was identical to the spiral drawn by William Banks in his lost 19th century letters. A spiral that connected symbols across the stone. Reeves leaned closer to the monitor. The alignment pointed to a specific cluster of hieroglyphs, one scholars had long dismissed as ornamental. But within their placement, there was rhythm, structure, intent. And in the center of that spiral, one glyph stood out. An unfamiliar one. A single triangular mark with 3 faint points etched around it, so faint they seemed accidental. But Reeves knew better. He had studied scripts from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. This was not Egyptian, nor Greek, nor any language known to history. That night, he barely slept. He cross-referenced the symbol with ancient catalogs, image databases, and archaeological records. He found it only once, on a shard of obsidian discovered in southern Turkey, near the same quarry where the Rosetta Stone's basalt had been traced. The shard, dismissed as debris, bore a near-identical marking, carved beside an image of a rising sun. The next morning, Reeves contacted the British Museum Isse Directorate, requesting access to rescan the stone using full-spectrum imaging. His request was denied. The official reasoning: the artifact has undergone all permissible testing within conservation protocols. But he knew what it really meant. They were protecting it, or hiding something. Reeves didn't give up. A week later, through quiet favors and late-night arrangements, he found himself inside the museum's restricted wing after hours, accompanied by a single technician. The air was cold and dry, the smell of dust and ancient stone hanging like breath that never dissipated. They set up a portable imaging rig beside the enclosure, lights flickering softly. Reeves pressed a gloved hand against the glass, feeling a strange warmth radiate from the basalt beyond. "Just a few scans," he whispered. "We'll be quick!" The technician nodded. As the laser beams swept across the surface, the data streamed onto Reeves' laptop in pulsing waves. Layers unfolded. The known inscriptions, the faint undertext, the ghostly scars of older carvings. And then something new. A cluster of lines deep beneath the visible surface, too regular to be natural. The scans showed what appeared to be incised grooves, forming a series of interconnected triangles. It wasn't language, it was design. When Reeves rotated the image in 3D, the pattern aligned perfectly with celestial coordinates specifically. The constellation Orion as it appeared over Egypt around 10,000 BCE. He felt his pulse thudding in his throat. This can't be right. The technician leaned closer. "What is it?" Reeves stared at the glowing lines on his screen. "It's a map," That single word shifted the air. In that moment, the stone seemed to pulse, the reflections on its surface flickering like candlelight, though there was none. Reeves stepped back instinctively, the hum of the machines sounding suddenly too loud. The technician's voice broke through the tension. "You're seeing things. It's just interference." But Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that the stone was responding. As if, in peeling back its layers, they had stirred something long dormant. When the scan ended, he copied the data and shut down the equipment. The technician packed in silence. Reeves looked at the stone one last time before leaving. For a fraction of a second, he thought he saw his reflection distort, not stretch, not blur, but change. The face that looked back at him was older, hollow-eyed, watching. He didn't mention that part to anyone. Days later, while analyzing the data at his office, Reeves found that the alignment of triangles and stars converged on a single coordinate deep in the Egyptian desert, near a region known as Gabel el-Silsila, a quarry site used by ancient builders. The coordinates pointed not to the quarry itself, but to an area of bedrock that had never been excavated. The pattern wasn't random. It was an address. Reeves arranged a small expedition under the guise of geological research. He traveled to Egypt, joined by 2 graduate students and a local guide. The heat was merciless, the desert stretching endless and unforgiving. By the 4th day, they reached the coordinates. Nothing stood out, just wind, rock, and the slow passage of time. But beneath the sand, their instruments detected a cavity, artificial, rectangular. They dug carefully. Hours turned into night. Then the shovels struck stone. Beneath layers of dust, they uncovered a slab of dark rock, smoother than the surrounding sandstone, marked by faint inscriptions. Reeves brushed away the grit, his flashlight trembling over the surface. There, faint but unmistakable, was the same triangular symbol, 3 points encircling it. It wasn't a coincidence. The Rosetta Stone had been pointing here. As they cleared the slab, they realized there was a door, sealed with resin, hardened into black glass. Around its edges, hieroglyphs spiraled inward, the same spiral pattern from the earlier discoveries. Reeves felt a shiver crawl down his spine as he traced them with his fingers. Each symbol seemed to hum beneath his touch. The guide stepped back nervously. "This is not Egyptian," he murmured. "This is something else." Reeves nodded slowly. "I think it's older." That night, the desert was unnaturally still. The team set up camp beside the buried doorway, their lamps flickering weakly against the endless dark. The sand whispered like static, and every gust carried the faint scent of stone dust and something else, something metallic, ancient, electric. Reeves lay awake, staring at the stars. The same constellations that had been carved beneath the Rosetta Stone now glittered overhead, cold and indifferent. In his mind, he could see the lines connecting them, forming the same geometry. He realized, with a sudden, sick clarity, the map wasn't just showing the site, it was marking time. Orion hadn't looked like that since the last ice age. The Rosetta Stone wasn't merely pointing to a place, it was pointing to an era. He sat up, heart pounding. What if the stone wasn't just a translator between languages, but between civilizations separated by thousands of years? What if its original creators had known that one day their knowledge would vanish, and they left behind a key not just for words, but for rediscovery? As dawn crept over the horizon, Reeves made his decision. They would open the door. The resin was brittle with age, cracking under careful chisels. Each fracture released a faint hiss like trapped air escaping from another world. When the final seal broke, a rush of dry, cold wind poured out, carrying with it a smell of dust and oil and something anciently alive. They shone their lights inside. The chamber was small, barely large enough to stand in its walls covered in carvings. Not hieroglyphs, not any script Reeves recognized. Lines intersected and swirled like circuits, forming a language of geometry and motion. In the center stood a pedestal. Upon it lay another stone, smaller, darker, almost identical in shape to the Rosetta Stone, but perfectly preserved, untouched by time. Its surface shimmered faintly under the flashlight, as though reflecting light from within. Reeves approached, his footsteps echoing in the still air. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to thrum, not with sound, but vibration. His hand trembled as he reached toward it. The surface was warm. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered out. Darkness swallowed the chamber. He heard one of the students gasp, then silence. Only the hum remained, rising in pitch, resonating through the stone beneath his palm. And in that instant, an image flooded his mind, vast fields of sand turning green, rivers carving through ancient lands, stars aligning over colossal structures that no longer existed. He saw beings human, but not as he knew them, carving symbols with deliberate care, looking skyward as if waiting for something to return. Then it was gone. The lights blinked back on. Reeves stumbled backward, gasping for air. The pedestal was empty. The smaller stone had vanished. No one spoke. The guy broke the silence first. We should leave this place. Reeves didn't argue. As they emerged into the blinding sunlight, he felt a chill run through him. Something had followed them out. Not a sound, not a shadow, but a knowing, as if the stones themselves had awakened, aware that they had been found. Back in London, the news never reached the public. The expedition's findings were confiscated, the site sealed off by authorities citing safety concerns. Reeves was questioned, then dismissed. His reputation crumbled overnight, but in private, he wrote his account every detail, every sound, every impossible vision. In his final entry, he left one sentence circled in ink, trembling but deliberate. The Rosetta Stone was never meant to teach us how to read the past. It was meant to remind us that the past can read us, and somewhere beneath the sands of Egypt, in the place where he once stood. A faint hum continues, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat waiting to be heard again. The silence inside the museum was absolute, the kind that presses against your skin and fills your lungs like water. Dim lights glowed against the polished glass cases, their reflections shimmering on the marble floor like faint ghosts of another time. Thomas stood before the Rosetta Stone once again, its gray surface, fractured yet eternal. The ancient letters, etched deep into the stone, seemed alive under the artificial glow, Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic, a chorus of voices trapped in stone, whispering truths the world had almost forgotten. But this time, Thomas wasn't looking for translation. He was looking for what lay beyond it. He remembered the note, the one left behind by DuPont, and its final words. The stone doesn't just speak. It remembers. For weeks, Thomas had replayed those words in his mind like a haunting melody, unsure if they were metaphor or madness. Yet the deeper he dug, the stranger the trail became. DuPont's research wasn't limited to linguistics. There were maps of energy fields, electromagnetic patterns around ancient temples, and theories about how the human voice, when tuned to a certain frequency, could resonate with the same vibrational patterns found in the Rosetta Stone. It wasn't language DuPont had been studying. It was sound. Thomas leaned closer to the glass now, his breath fogging its surface. Beyond his reflection, he could almost feel the hum, low and steady, like the stone itself was breathing. Maybe it was his imagination. Maybe not. He closed his eyes, letting the faint rhythm of the museum's air system fade into the background, listening instead for something older, deeper. And then he heard it faint but distinct, a tremor beneath the floor. It wasn't loud, more like a shiver through the bones of the earth. His eyes snapped open. The lights flickered. For a moment, he thought he saw the shadows bend, the carved symbols shimmering as though they were moving ever so slightly. A guard's voice broke the spell distant, calling out something about a power fluctuation, but Thomas could barely hear him. The sound had awakened something inside him. Later that night, in his cluttered apartment, he spread out DuPont's documents again. There were sketches of the Rosetta Stone, overlaid with mathematical grids and strange annotations written in both French and Coptic. Some lines were circled repeatedly, coordinates, perhaps, or a sequence. He cross-referenced them with a map of Egypt and froze. The coordinates pointed to a desolate stretch of land near reshaped modern-day Rosetta, not far from where the stone had been discovered in 1799. He booked a flight the next morning. The air in Egypt was thick with dust and memory. As Thomas walked through the ruins near the Nile Delta, the sun blazed overhead like molten copper. The village nearby was quiet, its walls painted with fading blues and ochres, remnants of another age. He met a local historian named Amira, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and a calm voice that carried both curiosity and caution. When Thomas mentioned DuPont's name, her expression changed. "DuPont was here," she said, "years ago." He believed the stone was only one piece of something greater, a message scattered across time. She led him to an old excavation site half swallowed by the desert. The wind whispered through broken columns, carrying with it the scent of sand and salt from the sea. Amira pointed to an exposed slab of stone partially buried in the earth. Its surface was covered in symbols, not hieroglyphs, not Greek, but something in between. Thomas knelt beside it, brushing the dust away. The carvings formed patterns that seemed to echo the Rosetta inscriptions but arranged differently, almost like a sequence. He felt his pulse quicken. This was no coincidence. The markings weren't words, they were instructions. That night, under a vast canopy of stars, he sat with Amira by the remains of an ancient wall, spreading out papers, translations, and DuPont's notes. The two of them worked by the flicker of a small oil lamp, their shadows swaying like specters. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to form. Amira noticed something he had missed. A repetition of 3 specific symbols in DuPont's drawings. When arranged in a certain order, they mirrored a sound frequency chart that matched the resonant pitch of granite. DuPont hadn't been studying translation. He had been decoding vibration. The Rosetta Stone, he theorized, wasn't simply a text. It was a key, one designed to unlock a hidden structure when subjected to a precise harmonic frequency. Thomas's mind raced. Could that be why DuPont had vanished? Had he found the frequency and triggered something? The wind howled through the ruins, scattering sand across their notes. For a moment, it almost sounded like a whisper. The following morning, they decided to test DuPont's theory. Using a portable frequency generator and a small granite fragment taken from the excavation site, Thomas adjusted the settings to match the resonance DuPont had recorded, 432 Hz. The same frequency ancient civilizations had often associated with harmony and creation. The sound began as a soft hum, then deepened into a steady pulse. The granite shard quivered ever so slightly, its surface vibrating in rhythm with the sound. Then, without warning, a crack appeared across the fragment. Light, faint, but visible, leaked from within. A glow like dying embers flickering inside stone. Thomas's breath caught. Amira stared in stunned silence. When the frequency faded, the light dimmed and vanished. The stone was split open, hollow at its core. Inside was something small and metallic. A disc, ancient and engraved. Its surface bore markings eerily similar to those on the Rosetta Stone. Thomas turned it over, brushing off centuries of dust. "It's not Egyptian," Amira whispered. This looks older." They took it back to Cairo, where they used imaging tools to analyze its structure. The patterns on the disc weren't random. They aligned perfectly with the constellation Orion, and at the center was an engraved eye. The Eye of Ra, perhaps, or something else entirely. Beneath it, faintly visible, was a single Greek phrase: "When the voices unite, the gates will open." 4 days. Thomas couldn't sleep. His dreams were filled with shifting lights, echoing sounds, and visions of carved symbols floating through endless darkness. He woke each night with DuPont's words echoing in his head. The stone remembers. What if the Rosetta Stone wasn't meant to be read, but heard? Driven by obsession, Thomas arranged to return to the British Museum under the guise of academic research. With Amira's help, he secured temporary access to the artifact after hours. The museum was quiet that night. Every corridor steeped in an otherworldly stillness. The hum of the city beyond its walls was faint, distant, as if the world itself had paused. They set up the frequency generator again, this time with the full calibration DuPont had mapped out. Thomas's hands trembled as he adjusted the controls. Amira stood near the display, eyes locked on the stone. When the generator began to hum, the air thickened instantly. The glass surrounding the Rosetta Stone began to vibrate. A deep resonance filled the hall, not just sound, but something felt in the chest, in the bones. The symbols on the stone shimmered faintly, as though responding. Then came the light, faint threads of blue tracing through the ancient carvings like veins of energy waking from millennia of slumber. The Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic lines pulsed in alternating rhythm like a code being spoken aloud for the first time in 2,000 years. Amira gasped, her voice lost in the rising hum. The floor beneath them trembled. A display case nearby rattled and fell, shattering glass across the marble. Thomas tried to shut down the generator, but the controls were unresponsive. The machine was locked in resonance. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The lights in the museum flickered back to normal. The Rosetta Stone lay silent once more. Thomas fell to his knees, breathless. Amira stared at him, her face pale. "What did we just do?" she whispered. He looked up at the stone, still faintly glowing at its edges. "We woke it up," he said quietly. In the silence that followed, a faint crack echoed through the hall. Not from the machine, not from the glass, but from within the stone itself. A hairline fracture spread across its surface, straight down the center. And behind that fracture, something shifted. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like the murmur of voices long buried, began to rise. Thomas froze, his heart pounding in his throat. Amira's eyes widened as she took a step back. The voices weren't speaking any known language, yet somehow, impossibly, he could understand them. They weren't telling a story. They were giving a warning. The sound grew louder, not in volume, but in presence. It seemed to vibrate through the very air, threading between heartbeats, filling the space between thoughts. Thomas stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The whispers were everywhere, echoing off the stone walls, rippling across the floor like waves of lightless energy. Amira pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound wasn't something heard. It was something felt, ancient, intelligent, deliberate. The fracture across the Rosetta Stone widened with a sharp crack. The faint blue light from within spilled out like liquid electricity, snaking across the marble floor in tendrils of shifting geometry. It crawled up the pillars, tracing patterns older than language itself. Thomas felt his knees weaken. It wasn't chaos. The light moved with rhythm, with purpose. It was writing! Symbols formed and dissolved in the air. Glyphs suspended in luminous mist, Greek entwining with hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs bending into unfamiliar curves that shimmered and vanished before his eyes. The stone wasn't just remembering. It was speaking, Amira whispered. It's consciousness. Her voice trembled. It's alive! The lights in the museum flickered violently, then died altogether. For an instant, there was only blackness, deep and absolute. Then came the sound of breath. Not human, not mechanical, deep, resonant, endless, as if the earth itself had drawn air after centuries of silence. And then, in that void, a single word formed in Thomas's mind. A word that wasn't spoken aloud, yet struck him like thunder. "Listen!" he gasped, stumbling backward. Amira grabbed his arm, but he barely felt her touch. The world around him dissolved into light and shadow, the walls of the museum melting away into something vast and infinite. He was standing in a desert, but not the desert of now. The sky was low and red, the air heavy with heat. Great columns rose from the earth, and a procession of priests moved toward a colossal slab, the Rosetta Stone, new and unbroken. He saw hands carving its symbols, felt their prayers woven into every cut. But there was fear in their movements. The kind that comes from knowing they were sealing something away, not revealing it. A figure stood apart, a priest draped in black linen, face obscured. His voice rose in chant, and the wind carried it like a warning across centuries. The others hesitated, their chisels trembling. Thomas could see now. The Rosetta Stone wasn't meant as translation between men, but as a seal between worlds. A lock! The figure turned toward him then, eyes glowing through the veil of time. "You broke the silence," he said, the voice reverberating through Thomas's bones. "And now, it remembers you." The vision shattered. He was back in the museum, on his knees. the cold marble against his palms. The lights returned in a flicker of sterile white, but the fracture in the Rosetta Stone still glowed faintly, like an ember that refused to die. Amira crouched beside him, her voice shaking. "What did you see?" Thomas looked up at the ancient artifact, his breath unsteady. "It wasn't a message," he whispered. "It was a warning. And we just unlocked it." A deep rumble echoed through the building, faint but growing. Somewhere below, the foundation groaned. Security alarms blared to life, red lights spinning across the hall. The vibration in the air intensified, the faint blue lines pulsing brighter, faster, the same rhythm as a heartbeat. "Thomas!" Amira pulled him toward the exit, but he resisted, turning back to the stone. "It's reacting," he said. "It's looking for something for us." The ground jolted, a violent tremor that threw both of them against the wall. Glass shattered, exhibits toppled, and the lights burst in a flash of sparks. The Rosetta Stone's glow surged until it filled the entire room, a flood of light that erased all shadow. For an instant, Thomas felt weightless, as though time itself had loosened its grip. Then, silence. He opened his eyes slowly. The museum was still, covered in dust and debris. The light had vanished, but the air carried the residue of energy like static clinging to his skin. The Rosetta Stone was no longer whole. The fracture had deepened completely, splitting the ancient slab into two halves. Between them, embedded in the floor, was a shape, small, metallic, and glowing faintly. Another disc! Amira approached cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence. She knelt beside the fragment, tracing its edge with her trembling fingers. "It's the same as the one from Rosetta," she said, all mingling with dread. "The same markings. The same constellation!" But there was something new, a spiral engraved at the center, radiating outward like a pulse. Thomas touched it gently. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, a burst of light shot through the cracks, and his mind filled with images, not of words, but of memory. He saw the fall of empires, the burning of libraries, the loss of knowledge, and the slow decay of understanding. Every age, every civilization had reached for the truth, and each time, the truth had consumed them. He staggered back, breath ragged. "This isn't translation," he said. "It's transmission." The stone was never just an artifact. It's part of something that carries knowledge across time. Knowledge that doesn't want to be known. Amira stared at him, horror dawning in her eyes. "And we've just reactivated it." Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. The tremor subsided, but the air remained thick with a strange pressure, the kind that precedes a storm. Thomas looked at the broken stone, its one silent surface now pulsing faintly like a dying star. "We have to go," Amira said. Before a deep, resonant tone filled the hall again, one single note, low and perfect, vibrating through every atom of the room. The security lights flickered once more. On the wall behind the shattered display, something began to appear, faint symbols, glowing through the paint and stone as though the building itself were being the same glyphs, the same language. The Rosetta Stone's song was spreading. Thomas turned to Amira, realization hitting him like ice. "It's copying itself." Her eyes widened. "You mean it's not bound to the stone anymore," he said. "It's alive." They ran through the dark corridors of the museum, their footsteps echoing between ancient statues that seemed to watch them flee. Outside, the night was thick with mist. Streetlights flickered in rhythm with that same low tone, each flash syncing perfectly. As if London itself had fallen under an invisible pulse, Amira clutched her coat tight. "Where do we go?" Thomas stared at the skyline, the dim glow of the Thames, the silhouette of the British Museum behind them like a sleeping giant. "Dupont tried to stop this," he murmured. "He must have found something, a counter-frequency, a way to silence it." Amira nodded, her face pale but resolute. "Then we find where he stopped." But even as they spoke, the sound deepened. The ground beneath their feet thrummed faintly, and distant windows began to rattle. Thomas looked up at the sky, clouds swirling in unnatural spirals above the city, faint traces of light, moving like veins of lightning that never struck. A storm without thunder. The same symbols he had seen within the Rosetta Stone now shimmered faintly across the clouds, drawn in pure luminescence. They weren't random. They were forming words. He couldn't read them fully, not yet, but he knew the feeling they carried. Warning. Memory. Repetition. It had happened before. Thomas felt the weight of time pressing against his chest, realization clawing its way into his mind. The Rosetta Stone had survived conquests, fires, revolutions, not by chance, but because it wanted to. It endured not as history, but as a mechanism, one that waited for the right conditions to awaken again. And he had given it exactly what it needed. He looked at Amira, his voice breaking through the hum of the storm. "We didn't uncover history," he said softly. "We released it." The wind tore through the street, scattering dust and papers into the air. In the distance, the museum lights surged one final time before plunging into darkness. The pulse of sound faded, replaced by an almost painful quiet. Amira's voice was barely a whisper. "What happens now?" Thomas looked toward the horizon, where the first pale light of dawn was trying to break through the clouds, and for a moment he thought he saw shapes moving in the mist. Not human. Not shadows. Memories, alive and shifting, returning to where they once belonged. He exhaled slowly, his words almost lost to the wind. "Now," he said, "it remembers us." And in the distance, beneath the earth, something answered. The storm had passed, but the air still trembled with its memory. A faint light stretched over the London skyline, dissolving the mist into threads of silver. The city lay hushed beneath the dawn, still, uncertain, like it too was trying to remember what had just occurred. The British Museum stood silent and bruised, its facade scarred by cracks that glowed faintly before fading into nothing. The world felt paused, as if the earth had taken a deep breath and was waiting to decide whether to exhale or hold it forever. Thomas stood at the edge of the Thames, staring into the water that carried the ghost of the sunrise. His reflection stared back at him, pale, sleepless, and haunted by things words could no longer explain. Behind him, Amira approached quietly, her footsteps soft against the stone. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The silence between them said everything. They had witnessed something that could never be proven. Something that didn't fit within the borders of history or science. And yet it was real. More real than anything Thomas had ever translated. More alive than the words carved into any ancient slab. He turned toward her. "It's gone quiet," he said, his voice rough. "For now." Amira nodded, her eyes distant. "Maybe it's done what it needed to do." He looked back at the horizon. The light was spreading now, soft and golden, warming the broken edges of the city. It was strange how peaceful it looked, how easily the world carried on. Unaware that something ancient had stirred beneath its foundations. Perhaps it had always been this way. Perhaps humanity had lived for centuries beside these sleeping memories, waking them only when curiosity grew louder than caution. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The river flowed past, eternal and indifferent, carrying away what the night had left behind. Thomas finally broke the silence. "You saw it too," he said quietly. "The visions, the symbols, the voices." Amira's expression softened. "I saw memory," she said. "Not just theirs. Ours, too. Every civilization trying to preserve what it fears to lose, until it forgets why it wanted to keep it in the first place." Her words lingered between them like mist. Thomas thought of DuPont, of the cryptic notes, the vanished man who had walked this same path and left behind only riddles. Maybe DuPont had reached the same conclusion, that the Rosetta Stone wasn't a tool of understanding, but of remembrance, a bridge built not to translate words, but to translate existence. He closed his eyes. He could still feel the hum beneath his skin, the echo of the resonance that had awakened the stone. But now it wasn't threatening. It was almost gentle. A heartbeat that no longer demanded attention but simply was. When he opened his eyes, Amira was studying the water. "Do you think it will happen again?" she asked. Thomas hesitated. "Not like that," he said. "But memory never really disappears. It just waits." He took a deep breath. the cold air filling his lungs, grounding him. Maybe that's what the stone was trying to tell us all along. Not to remember everything, but to remember that we were never alone in time. A faint smile touched Amira's lips. That's almost poetic. Maybe, he said, his eyes tracing the slow ripples of the river. Or maybe it's just the truth wearing poetry as a disguise. A distant bell chimed from somewhere across the city. The first of the morning. Its echo drifted through the fog, soft and familiar. Thomas watched as a group of people appeared on the bridge, commuters unaware that beneath their feet, the world's oldest conversation had just continued for the first time in 2,000 years. He wondered if they'd feel it, that subtle pulse beneath the earth, the faint hum of history whispering just beyond perception. Maybe they'd dismiss it as imagination. Or maybe, without knowing why, they'd simply look up for a moment, sensing something vast and unspoken, watching quietly from the edges of the ordinary. Back inside the museum, workers and curators moved cautiously through the damaged halls. The Rosetta Stone lay in two perfect halves, each piece smooth where it had split, as if the break had been intentional. Experts would spend years debating how it happened, what caused the impossible fracture, why the air around it still felt strangely heavy. But none of them would see what Thomas and Amira had seen. None of them would hear the faint echo that still lingered between the halves, a resonance so low, so subtle, it could easily be mistaken for silence. And yet, if one listened closely enough, it almost sounded like breathing. Amira and Thomas returned one last time, standing before the cracked relic. It sat under temporary lights, surrounded by cables and scanners, stripped of its myth, reduced once again to artifact. And yet, it still held something defiant. A quiet, impossible presence that refused to be fully understood. Amira looked at him, her voice soft. "You could tell them," she said. "About what really happened?" "About what it means." Thomas shook his head. "They wouldn't believe it." He paused, then added, "Maybe they shouldn't." She frowned slightly, confused. He smiled faintly. "Some knowledge isn't meant to be taught. It's meant to be remembered in the moments between discovery and doubt. If the stone taught us anything, it's that the truth doesn't need translation. It just needs to survive." They stood in silence for a long time. The air was calm again. The kind of calm that follows storms too big to name. As they turned to leave, Thomas looked back one final time. The light hit the surface of the broken stone just right, scattering reflections across the room, faint patterns that shimmered like the remnants of ancient constellations. For an instant, he could almost see them again. The glyphs, the voices, the unbroken chain of memory stretching across millennia. And in that vision, he felt no fear. Only connection! Outside, the city had awakened. Cars moved. People hurried. Life resumed its usual rhythm. But the world looked subtly different now, as if it, too, carried the echo of something newly remembered. Thomas and Amira walked side by side, neither speaking. The morning light painted the wet pavement gold. When they reached the end of the street, Amira stopped and looked back toward the museum. "Do you think we changed anything?" she asked quietly. Thomas thought for a moment. The wind carried the scent of rain, and somewhere in the distance, a bird took flight, its wings catching the sunlight. He smiled, not in certainty, but in peace. "Maybe not the world," he said, "but maybe the way it remembers itself." For a long moment, they simply stood there, letting the day unfold around them. And in that silence, that fragile, human stillness, the story of the Rosetta Stone felt complete. Not as a discovery, not as a mystery solved, but as a reminder that every word carved, every sound spoken, every thought remembered is part of something larger, a dialogue across time. The river kept moving. The wind whispered through the city's cracks, and deep beneath the British Museum, where light could no longer reach, two halves of an ancient stone pulsed faintly in the dark, a heartbeat echoing through centuries. Somewhere between past and present, between silence and sound, the stone dreamed. And in its dreaming, it carried a question that no one could ever translate. Only feel, what if history doesn't end when we stop remembering it, but when it stops, remembering us? The question lingered like a breath suspended in time, fading only as the morning sun rose higher, washing the city in light, carrying the echoes of forgotten voices into a new day.